This is an excerpt from my book, Traveling the Wilderness Road. Most of North America remained a wilderness for over 100 years after the settlement of the New World began. Cities grew along the eastern shoreline, but the expansive continent to the west was mostly untouched by the English and Dutch immigrants who still had ties to their homelands. When the Scots, Irish, and the Germans arrived, however, they had no intention of returning to their native lands. They had come to escape poor harvests, high rents, and religious intolerance. They looked to the south and the west for land on which to begin their new lives. As the settlers moved inland, they usually traveled along the paths over which the Indians had hunted and traded. The Indians, in developing these paths, had followed the traces or trails that were worn down by the herds of buffalo that roamed the lands in search of food or water sources. The most traveled of these Indian routes was the Great Wagon Road. The Iroquois tribesmen of the north had used this route to travel southward, where they traded or made war in Virginia and the Carolinas. The Cherokee and Shawnee used the trails to create seasonal villages and make attacks on each other. They called the path the Athawamani, variously translated as Path of the Armed Ones or the Great Warrior's Path. In some areas, the same trail was known as the Great Trading Path or the Great Valley Road. An early treaty guaranteed use of this route to the Indians. The road, which began in Philadelphia, connected the Pennsylvania communities of Lancaster, York, Gettysburg, Chambersburg, and Greencastle. It passed through western Maryland near what is now Hagerstown. It crossed the Potomac River at Watkins Ferry in Virginia, then on to Winchester and through the Shenandoah Valley to Harrisonburg, Stanton, Lexington, and Roanoke. Long hunters used the path to develop an early fur trade. A long hunter was an explorer and hunter who made expeditions into the American frontier wilderness for months at a time. Most long hunts originated in the valley of the Clinch River, known as the Pellissippi by the Cherokee, in southwest Virginia, or nearby Holston River Valley, called Hogohigi, and considered by the Cherokee to be the headwaters of the Tennessee River. The hunting parties consisted of only 2 or 3 men. Larger parties were more likely to scare away the game, and the Indians were less likely to become suspicious of small groups of travelers. The men would start their hunts in October and return home around the end of March or early April. For those who were first-generation immigrants, this was their first time hunting unrestricted. It had been reserved for the privileged few who were allowed to hunt in the royal game preserves of their native lands. The long hunters, as well as soldiers and early settlers, spread the news that land was plentiful. The small path became a major migration route. In 1744, the Indians agreed to relinquish their claim on the Great Wagon Road. Both German and Scots-Irish immigrants had already been following the route into Virginia and beyond. English colonists encroached onto territories claimed by France, which was one of the reasons the French and Indians went to war against England and the colonists. The Germans and Scots-Irish found themselves caught up in the French and Indian War. Western North Carolina seemed a safe place to escape the war because, at least in the beginning, the Cherokee were on the side of the British. When the war ended in 1764, although northern settlements had suffered a loss of population, Virginia and North Carolina had grown. The peace treaty that ended the war stated that no English settlers would go across the Appalachians. There were few westward paths across the Appalachian Mountains, which formed an intimidating barrier between the Atlantic and the interior of the continent. Lewis Evans labeled the Appalachian chain "endless mountains" in his 1755 map of the British colonies. That is the way it must have seemed to the explorers who set out for the unfamiliar lands. In 1673, Shawnee warriors had captured a young man named Gabriel Arthur. Before his release, Arthur became the first white settler known to have crossed the mountains. In 1749, the Loyal Land Company was founded in Albemarle County, Virginia, with Dr. Thomas Walker as a leading member. The company received a grant of 800,000 acres in what is now southeastern Kentucky and extreme southwestern Virginia, with the stipulation that the land be settled within 4 years, during which time the company would be allowed to make surveys. The royal governor of the colony of Virginia was a co-investor in the Loyal Land Company, and although sworn to enforce the royal proclamation which protected the Indian Territory from settlement by the whites, he encouraged settlement of the land. The company appointed Dr. Walker to lead an expedition to explore and survey the region. Walker was an experienced surveyor and had already traversed the western country at least once. In 1748, along with a group of long hunters, he had traveled as far south as the Fork country of the Holston, which is present-day Kingsport, Tennessee. On March 7, 1750, Walker and 5 others began their journey in Albemarle County. One of the group's members was Ambrose Powell, for whom Powell Mountain and Powell River would be named. On April 13th, the group entered what they called Cave Gap. It was later renamed Cumberland Gap by hunters. Walker noted in his journal, quote, "We went 4 miles to a large creek, which we called Cedar Creek, being a branch of Bear Grass, and from thence 6 miles to Cave Gap. On the top of the ridge are several trees marked with crosses. Others blazed, and several figures painted on them. A birch stands on the left hand, on which I cut my name. This gap may be seen at a considerable distance, and there is no other that I know of, except one about 2 miles to the north of it, which does not appear to be so low as the other." End quote. The forces within the earth had pushed the Cumberland Mountains upward, while at the same time a swift creek cut a great V-shaped notch in the rock. The gap opens into a low valley formed over 300 million years ago by a meteorite impact. On the far side of the meteorite crater is a gap in Pine Mountain. It was the combination of these features that created a doorway in the mountains. The party continued westward where, on April 28th, they erected a small cabin, the first house built in Kentucky by white men, approximately 4 miles below present-day Barbourville. Discouraged by the rough terrain in southeastern Kentucky, the group returned to Albemarle County. Walker's detailed journal proved to be a valuable resource for later expeditions.